Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to another episode of the Ummah Times. And today we are honored to have Brother Hamza in our virtual studio to discuss about Islamic law, its history and evolution. Assalamu alaikum, Brother Hamza, and how are you doing?
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. I'm doing good, alhamdulillah.
That's great. Well, thank you for joining us. And before we get into the discussion, I want to tell the audience a little bit about Brother Hamza. Brother Hamza, I would consider him as quite the academic in Islamic law and quite the student regarding Islamic jurisprudence. He is currently teaching Islamic history at Mishka University. And also, he is doing his PhD in Islamic Civilization Studies at Emory University. So again, I'd like to welcome you, Brother Hamza. And right now, you're stationed in which city in the States?
I just moved to Atlanta, Georgia, but I was in Minneapolis before that, and I've lived in Chicago as well.
Oh, okay. So how did your move go? Like, how are you settling in there so far?
Well, it was a 16-hour drive, so that was pretty intense. I've just been sleeping on an air mattress, but my U-Haul crates, they're called U-boxes, are supposed to come sometime today, so that I'll have my Tempur-Pedic mattress back and the rest of my books.
Well, yeah, Ali was just telling me the other day he had an 8-hour drive. So yeah, 16 hours is double the trouble.
Yeah, my back, like part of my back went numb because I got degenerated discs. So it was intense.
Oh my God. Yeah, can imagine.
Well, you know what? You've been putting a lot of great work out there for the public, and it's amazing, right? You're, for example, that series I've started watching on the Hanafi School of Law. That is just amazing, and may Allah reward you for that continued great exposition you're doing, especially for the Muslims, because they're not a lot, they don't know about a lot of the intricacies of the evolution of Islamic jurisprudence. So that's great work you're doing. So we're going to start off with our first question. I believe Ali, you wanted to.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think before we delve into further details, I think if Brother Hamza, you could just talk about what essentially fiqh is, and its formulation, and then maybe we can touch upon its evolution, its origin and whatnot, and later on, we can talk about the codification of it. So just for our audience, we can probably start off with just a pure, simple definition and its origins and formulation.
I want to start by saying I'm honored to be here and thank you for all the kind words. I honestly didn't know how the Hanafi series would be received. I thought maybe it's too basic or too introductory, because there's definitely people out there that could do it better than me. But in terms of fiqh, what's the definition? What is it? So most people have heard the word Sharia law from Fox News or what have you, right? And that is Sharia in the objective, abstract sense, the law that's with God, a shara and the law. And Allah is known as the lawgiver, a shara. And in a lot of Arabic texts, they use the word shara to refer to revelation as a whole. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of inseparable from revelation, wahi, in a sense, or the Quran. And anyone who studies modern Arabic or Arabic dialects, usually the word for street is shari', which is related, it's the same root. And that's because Sharia is thought to be a path to goodness, or in the very, very pre-Islamic Arabic, classical Arabic, the path to water or to a well. And fiqh, it literally means understanding. And there's a famous hadith, man yuridullahu khayran yafaqqahu fid-din. So whoever Allah wants good for, he gives him understanding of the religion. And so fiqh means understanding, but it's kind of like a deep insight into the intricacies of something. And fiqh refers to the man-made interpretation of Sharia, what human beings think Allah wants from us. What does God want from us? That's the big question in religious ethics. And that's what fiqh aims to answer, basically. So fiqh is different from Sharia in the sense that it's a man-made interpretation, or the fancy word is hermeneutics. Whereas Sharia is an abstract, objective thing that only Allah truly knows all the details. So I hope that makes sense.
I think it's Shani, you're on mute.
It's Jazakallah khair for sharing that.
Yeah.
That's that's a good starter on defining what fiqh means, and I guess can you give us just a short summary, because obviously there are a lot of details from the evolution on the evolution of fiqh from the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his companions, and how they kind of formulated decisions to the emergence of the schools of law that we now know of. So if you can kind of tell us a little bit about the how the evolution of all of it, and now where we are at right now.
So when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was alive and receiving revelation, he was the de facto lawgiver, if you will. The Sahaba went to him for any legal questions. And we know that before prophethood, he was a muhakkam, or arbitrator. So he was familiar with law, how law works, ﷺ, and he knew about Jewish law and Christian law. All that stuff was in the intellectual milieu of the time. And he had met with monks on his travels to Syria and the caravans, and we know that there was Jews in Yathrib who came to Mecca and made pilgrimage to the Kaaba even, and things like that. So the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he would, in a sense, be a lawyer, is what we would say today, even before receiving revelation. And of course, after receiving revelation, he had, the divine Sharia from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And after the passing of our beloved Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, then you had Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, Muawiyah, and so on, who in a sense were the de facto lawgivers because they were Khalifatullah. And as Amir al-Mu'mineen, commander of the believers, they gave the Amr, the command, right? So for instance, one case that I really like to talk about, because in America, we live in a very hyper-capitalistic society. So whatever the dominant structure is, I'm always looking to kind of subvert that. And Omar, in a time of famine, he actually fixed market prices. And he fixed the price of bread, and he had various types of market control. So they have discretion, as to interpreting the Sharia based on principles that they learned in Islam, and they set precedents. And we don't know very much what happened during the Umayyad period. So Muawiyah, being the fifth caliph, starts the Umayyad caliphate, and there's not a lot of texts that survive from that time period. But what we can glean from later texts from the Abbasid period that talk about the Umayyad period is that this was it was a time of immense expansion. The Islamic expansion over various territories was very quick. Persia was conquered in less than a year, and they had to quickly come up with a system of administration. So they had to consult all of the non-Muslims in these conquered territories as to how administration was done in those lands. Previously, a lot of things were retained just for smoothness. And so a lot of law, as historians think, was kind of very ad hoc. And it was at the discretion of various military commanders, or umara, plural of amir, or, they're also called imams or imma. And so these imams who are on the battlefield would kind of have to make quick legal decisions. And an example of that is from Imam al-Awza'i. He was a big imam in Syria during the Umayyad times, the end of the Umayyad period. And he lived through the Abbasid revolution. He was a contemporary of Abu Hanifa. And there's an academic by the name of Stephen Judd. He wrote a book on Awza'i and some academic articles. And he argues that Awza'i and Sufyan al-Thawri in Kufa were both kind of formed one madhab. They had a lot of the same students and a lot of the same opinions. And he calls it the Umayyad madhab. And if you look at one of their students, Al-Fazari, he preserves a lot of Imam Awza'i's opinions about war and the battlefield. And then the Hanafis try to refute Awza'i. They have this book, Rad ala Siyar al-Awza'i, which also quotes extensively from Awza'i's, one of his texts that's now lost, which is the Siyar. And all of it's about battle. Like, what do you do if you find a Greek book in Greek that you don't know what it's about? Do you burn it? Do you bury it? What are you supposed to do with it? Can you sell it? Because maybe it's a Bible, you don't even know. It's a Greek, it's a language you don't know. So there's all these kind of like, you know, what happens when you take this kind of war booty or when you come across this situation, but not a lot survives about like the ibadat or those types of things like praying, you know, your 5 daily prayers, except in later texts like from Imam al-Tabari, the famous scholar who wrote Tarikh al-Tabari, you know, his famous history. You got Tafsir al-Tabari, all these different things. He has a book called Ikhtilaf al-Fuqaha, Difference of Opinion Amongst the Jurists, where he, you know, mentions a lot of Imam al-Awza'i's and Sufyan al-Thawri's opinions about things. And you'll find it in different comparative fiqh books. Bidayat al-Mujtahid from Ibn Rushd, which is used to train muftis, contains some of that. But a lot of it doesn't survive or doesn't make it. And we know that those madhabs died out. Even Tabari, he had his own madhab called the Jariri madhab, which died out. And then during the Abbasid period, which Abu Hanifa was kind of the main protagonist, him and his students kind of made up the imperial law for the Abbasids. You see a big emergence of, you know, Islamic like legal development. So that's when you have Shafi'i with Kitab al-Risala, which for the longest time, most academics believed was the first usul fiqh work that is mostly being challenged now. Joseph Lowry, who's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, I believe, he has done very extensive research on the Risala, and he, I would say, proved beyond any doubt that the Risala is not an usul fiqh work per se, that it doesn't have the 4 sources of the law, because the later usulis, they would say that you have 4 sources of the law, which is the Quran, the Sunnah, qiyas or analogy, and ijma', which is consensus. And he says qiyas and ijma', they're not really talked about very much in the Risala as sources of law. And when you read it, you do notice that a lot of it is about refuting istihsan, refuting certain types of qiyas, and emphasizing using single transmitted hadith, what they call a hadith al-ahad, which was very a contentious topic during his time. And of course, during the Abbasid times, you had Imam Malik and Ahmed ibn Hanbal. And so the 4 madhabs kind of, in a sense, get their start during that time. The latest research, though, is showing that probably during the Umayyad period, the Mu'tazila and other different groups out there were having intense theological debates. And those intense debates often stemmed from linguistics, like linguistic analysis of Quranic verses. And so they talk about kham wal as, khas, sorry, am wal khas, the general and specific verses and how they might affect theology. And a lot of those theological discussions about linguistics got transferred over to usul fiqh. And a lot of the early Hanafis, a lot of people don't like to hear this, a lot of the early Hanafis were Mu'tazili.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying Abu Hanifa or his students direct some of it, like Muhammad al-Shaybani or Abu Yusuf, but there definitely was some Mu'tazili Hanafis in the very early period. It's undoubtedly so. It's mentioned in many, many, many texts. And so I think that these Mu'tazili-minded Hanafis brought over a lot of those linguistic topics into usul fiqh. And already in Muhammad al-Shaybani, who is a student of Abu Hanifa, there's a 12-volume book that he wrote, 12-volume in modern print, called Kitab al-Asl. It was published as a first complete edition in 2012. So before that, there was just manuscripts. And it has not been widely studied by academics or even ulama. And that's what I'm specializing in, is that book. And in it, you see usul fiqh already, or the very beginnings of it. So it's called Kitab al-Asl, which is singular for usul, right? And each ruling, they'll give the asl, or the basis behind that ruling or set of rulings. Like, all of these rulings came from qiyas on this hadith. All of these rulings came from istihsan, and so on and so forth. And there's even debates about usul fiqh within the book between different Hanafis. Muhammad al-Shaybani is trying to refute other Hanafis on certain issues, for instance. So we know that there also wasn't, a complete uniformity. He disagreed with Abu Yusuf. He disagreed with Abu Hanifa sometimes. And so that, in a sense, has changed historiography about the development of Islamic law. And then towards the end of the Abbasid period, you get a significant development in usul fiqh discourse. And you start to see more commentary, shuruh, of different earlier, like, small legal texts, mutun. You get more mukhtasars, more of these mutun, these kind of primers or very basic Islamic legal texts. And with the Hanafi madhab in particular, a lot of this activity, a lot of fiqh activity in general, was happening in Baghdad or Iraq, Kufa, Basra. Was starting to happen in Egypt with Layth, and Imam Shafi'i moved over there. You had Imam Awza'i in Syria, Imam Malik in Medina. So a lot of it was kind of based in those central Islamic lands, if you will, but it starts to shift later on, even to the peripheries, where the center of Hanafism changes to being in Central Asia, like Balkh, Samarkand, Termidh, and these different places in Khurasan. And you also have Hanafis going to Qayrawan in Tunisia. So they're going out west into North Africa. And of course, Malikis were already out there. Shafi'is are making their way out there. So you also see the geographical spread of the different madhahib, different schools of thought. And later on, you start to see like philosophy spring up among certain thinkers like Ibn Sina, Al-Kindi, Farabi, these kind of different philosophical thinkers that based a lot of their thought off of Greek texts that were translated into Arabic, and they kind of tried to Islamicize them, but a lot of their ideas were still very problematic according to the ulama. So you had someone like Imam Ghazali come and refute those philosophical texts. But he also takes from philosophy that which is beneficial. And he brings that into usul fiqh in his book, Al-Mustasfa. And that starts to spread to the other madhabs as well, because he was Shafi'i. The other madhabs kind of pick up some of the terminology and philosophical ideas. Qawa'id al-fiqh, or the legal maxims, kind of like these small principles. Al-yaqeen la yuzalu bi-shak is one of them. Certainty isn't lifted with a little bit of doubt. Basically, it's like a principle. So if you're certain you did something, but you're wondering, well, maybe I broke my wudu, maybe not, but I'm certain I made it, well, you have wudu. And those started to develop. They started first with the Hanafis, with Sarakhsi, but they started to develop with the other madhabs much more later on after Ghazali's time. Ghazali was the 11th, 12th century. In the 13th and 14th century, you start to have like the Ayyubid and Mamluk dynasties. And during that time, you see an explosion of like Qawa'id al-Fiqh literature, an explosion of Usul al-Fiqh literature, especially during Mamluk times, because the Mamluks, they were very pragmatic and very smart politicians, and they wanted to support all four madhabs equally. Before the Mamluk time, you never really heard of the Hanbali madhab. It was so small in number, it wasn't even talked about. You don't see it hardly mentioned by other madhabs. But the Mamluks kind of gave it a position of equality amongst the other three. And during the Mamluk time, you really get this strong idea that Sunnism is four madhabs. Because by that time, a lot of the other madhabs have died out. Jariri madhab is gone. The Laythi madhab, Awza'i's madhab, Ibn Hazm's madhab is barely hanging on by a thread. You have people like Ibn Hazm in Andalusia who are still kind of keeping it going, but it's pretty marginal. So it gives a boost to the Hanbali madhab and to the four madhabs in general. They produced a lot of scholarly content during that time, and also a lot of more comparative fiqh type texts, even usul fiqh type texts. So in the Hanafi madhab, there was a figure during that time. His name was Ibn Humam ad-Din, or just Ibn Humam for short. He wrote a comparative usul fiqh text, legal theory text, where he compared Shafi'i and Hanafi usul fiqh, and he makes a little bit of a synthesis between them, especially in terms of hadith. He tells his Hanafi counterparts, we need to accept more of these ahad hadith that the Shafi'is have always accepted since Kitab al-Risala, since Imam Shafi'i himself. Because the Hanafis before that, in terms of fiqh, would only use a hadith if it was a hadith mashhur, which meant that it had 3 chains of narration in each level, in each tabaqa, during the time of the Salaf. So they rejected a lot of other hadith that other madhabs would use because they didn't think those hadith were strong enough. And so Ibn Humam created a split, a schism in the madhab, where you had some Hanafis, usually the Arab Hanafis and Asian subcontinent Hanafis following Ibn Humam and becoming more hadith centric. And then the rest of the Hanafis, especially the Turkic Hanafis, Chinese Hanafis, many others around the world, they stuck with the older system of only accepting hadith mashhur. And when the Ottoman Empire came into being shortly after the Mamluks, they did not accept Ibn Humam's new type of usul fiqh. They rejected it. They were well aware of it. They even cited from his texts, but they kept the older system. So even now to this day, it's a split that you'll see in the madhab. So the madhabs themselves, they're not like a monolith. They have difference of opinion within madhabs internally. And then with colonization, European law was brought to the Muslim world, and international trade and capitalism, international law. And the Ottomans, they wanted to develop a system that could easily be disseminated internationally. And so they came up with a legal system, or a legal text rather, that's called the Majalla. And it was based on Hanafi fiqh, and it was translated into various European languages. And it was kind of a set code. So that's why perhaps some Orientalists said that like the door of ijtihad is closed or something like that, because, you know, they were trying to kind of make a legal code or system that stayed more or less the same and was kind of monolith just for ease of commercial trade. So it was very capitalist driven in that sense. It wasn't meant to erase difference of opinion, but some people felt that that's what it was doing in reality. And that was developed shortly before the fall of the Ottoman Empire. In Turkey, their ulama have written commentaries, you know, shuruh and hashia on the Majalla, but it's not widely studied amongst Hanafis outside of Turkey anymore, which is strange to me, because all the Hanafis will accept Ibn Abidin as kind of one of the major recent scholars. He has the famous book Hashiyat Ibn Abidin, and it was actually his son who was on the council to help create the Majalla. So why non-Turkish Hanafis have neglected this text nowadays, I'm not entirely sure. But that, in a nutshell, is kind of the history or development of Islamic law, overall of Islamic history. But of course, I'm oversimplifying and leaving a lot of things out.
No, I think that gives a really great overview, and thanks for that, Brother Hamza.
Great
Yeah,
comprehensive.
and this division you're talking about, like, for example, within the Hanafi school, where you have some Hanafis who are more hadith centric and the others that are not. Does this division exist? Does this similar kind of division exist in the other schools as well?
Yeah, so before I studied the Hanafi madhab, I studied the Hanbali madhab. And the interesting thing about it is, you know, they say that Ahmed ibn Hanbal primarily was a muhaddith and secondarily was a faqih. And so when it came to fiqh, he would sometimes issue two opinions on the same topic, the same mas'ala, same issue, because there might be two hadiths of equal strength that contradict each other. So he just said, well, you could do this or you could do that. And those were preserved by his son, Abdullah bin Ahmed bin Hanbal. And the earliest Hanbali text that was written was called Mukhtasar al-Khiraqi. And I read that in its entirety with a teacher and its commentary, Al-Mughni, which is a comparative fiqh text from Ibn Qudama. And you could see many times Ahmed ibn Hanbal is shown to give more than one opinion himself. And then probably the most controversial figure in the Hanbali madhab was Ibn Taymiyyah. And he was also a very novel thinker when it came to fiqh. He would issue opinions that went against all four madhabs sometimes, which was controversial in his time. But there is a great amount of diversity within the Hanbali madhab. I would say it's got more schisms than any other madhab, but in a good way. And it doesn't take away from their coherence or identity as a madhab. But I remember, like, in my Hanbali fiqh classes with, you know, traditional scholars, sometimes they would say in the madhab, there's 8 different opinions on this topic. And I believe the topic they were talking about was, does touching your genitals break your wudu? There's 8 different opinions, they told me. Ibn Taymiyyah has this opinion, Ibn Jawzi has this opinion, Ibn Qudama has this opinion, and so on and so forth. And it makes logical sense to me, because when you're accepting a lot more of the ahad, like Shafi'is and Hanbalis do, you're going to run into more textual contradictions or thorny things to kind of deal with, when sometimes hadiths of equal strength say slightly different stuff. And so some of them will come to the conclusion, well, there's multiple correct ways to do it.
So would you say that like, because the differences between between the madhabs, it stems from I guess a differing linguistic understanding in many cases, and also, you know, what you consider binding from particular hadiths. So, for example, I think in the Hanafi madhab, like if the Arabic says if you touched a woman, it doesn't mean, like, I think in other Muslims it means intercourse, and according to Hanafis it doesn't. So would it be fair to say, like, a lot of it is due to differing linguistic understandings, but is it a mixture of many? Yeah.
Yeah, linguistic understandings shape differences of opinion, as well as like, it's not only just the meanings of individual words that they might disagree about, but also different parts of Arabic grammar. For instance, wow, which means and. The Hanafis say when you have and in like a Quranic verse, in a command, or in a hadith, it doesn't imply a sequence. It's not tartib, as they would say in Arabic. The Shafi'is will say, no, this means tartib. It's a sequence, and then, and then, and then. And so the Hanafis, they're kind of famous for saying, well, legally you could start wudu by washing your feet. It's not preferred, but it'll be accepted. Where the Shafi'is say, no, in the Quranic verse, it has wow, which means and then, because it implies tartib. So you have to follow the order mentioned in the Quran. So that's a kind of difference in linguistic interpretation that, you know, that's one example between the different madhabs, but also they'll disagree as to which hadiths that you can use for fiqh, which ones are authentic enough for fiqh rulings. And they might disagree about ijma'. They'll say, well, ijma' says this, but then another scholar will say, no, ijma' says this. So they, you know, each scholar, individual scholar, sometimes has a different definition as to what ijma' means, or which scholars are actually scholars that are included in ijma'. They might also disagree about the aqwal of the Sahaba, the sayings of the companions, and which ones are authentic or inauthentic, just like the hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And there's certain companions they may accept and certain companions they may not accept. Nothing to do with theology like Sunni Shia, but like, for instance, the Hanafis, they will only accept opinions from a Sahabi if he was known as a faqih. Okay. And so Abu Huraira, he wasn't known as a faqih. So they would not take his opinion on legal issues. Ibn Humam argued that actually we should, and it shouldn't matter if they were a faqih or not. So that's a division in the madhab.
Right.
But then most of the madhabs by the late medieval period had accepted that you have to have qiyas, or analogy, and they differ in how they apply that. And they all accepted that you have to have some form of istihsan, is what it's called in the Hanafi madhab. It literally means seeking the good. Malikis sometimes call it istislah, which also is another way of seeking the good. And then istishab is what Shafi'is and Hanbalis often called it. And basically, sometimes there is a ruling where the purpose behind the ruling, what they call the illah, when you apply it in the ground, it has the opposite effects due to cultural changes or the way, you know, society is functioning. It has the opposite intended effect. Maybe the idea is to stop zina, but when you apply that rule, it actually makes zina more rampant, right? And so they had to build some kind of structure in place where they could still maintain the spirit of the Sharia, if you will. And so they call it istihsan, istislah, or istishab, whatever you want to call it. It's more or less the same thing. And so by the end of the medieval period, they all kind of had these systems in place in their usul fiqh, but they may have differed in how they implemented them. Even the Zahris, who lasted pretty much till the 1500s Gregorian as a madhab, they kind of, even though they would say they reject ijtihad, they would say they reject qiyas, they would say they reject istihsan, they had other things that were very similar in place, that they just, kind of had a logical way of finagling it, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, from the sounds of it, it seems like, there's anything but uniformity and consistency, within the history of madahibs, right? So hence, the madhism or the fanaticism, when it comes to, choosing between different madahibs, it doesn't really make any sense. It's not logical because, as you mentioned, within the same madhab, let's say Hanafi, you have probably 8 to 10 different opinions on just one matter, right? So how do you the layman people like us, really navigate and try to make sense out of this, especially in the modern times where we don't necessarily have access to ulama, at a level perhaps where people had back in the day, So how do we? What do you suggest? What do you recommend?
Well, even as much as I'm talking about difference of opinion and these types of things, when it comes to like the ibadat or the acts of worship, what makes up the 5 pillars of Islam, it's changed fairly little, actually, since the beginning of Islamic history. Even though they may have a little bit of difference of opinions, like where you put your hands and salah and that type of stuff, it's remained pretty consistent. Where a lot of the change happens is in what's called the mu'amalat, or the kind of societal interpersonal rules, because a lot of that's very contingent, not only on culture, but you have a wide ranging different kinds of hadith or sayings from the Sahaba, like I mentioned with Omar and fixing market prices. Uthman kind of reverses that. So it's clear that it's not something that always has to take place, but under certain conditions it'll take place, and so on and so forth. So it gets a bit more thorny there. But for the layperson, you just want to get a hold of the mukhtasar, the primer or matan, basic text in whatever madhab that you feel comfortable following. And that could be because you have easy access to a teacher from that madhab, you find it the most logical, you find it the easiest to practice, various reasons why you choose a madhab. And so for Hanafis, that would be Nur al-Idah from Shurun Bulali. A lot of people would start with al-Murshid al-Mu'in for Maliki madhab. They might start with Safinat al-Najah for Shafi'i, or they might start with blanking out for the Hanbali madhab right now, like maybe Zad al-Mustaqni' or something. That one's kind of more medium level text, but these are like the basic mutun or texts of the madhabs that give you a firm foundation as to what the predominant opinion is. And then the more you read, it'll get more, the upper level stuff will get more and more into difference of opinion. I encourage everyone to read like the easiest usul fiqh or legal theory book in your madhab, just to get an idea as to what it's about. And they sometimes talk about difference of opinion. And the deeper you get into reading all that kind of stuff, you'll start to see the difference of opinions, what's acceptable and unacceptable. And you get kind of a bird's eye view as to what all the ulama agree on, what they disagree on, what's essential in Islam, what's a little more superfluous or, superfluous or whatever, however you want to pronounce it, what's like kind of more extra credit, if you will, and not so fundamental to the religion. Paying zakat is fundamental. Abu Bakr fought the Ridda wars over it. But how you pay zakat exactly, it's not as fundamental, right? There's disagreement. Can you pay it with money? Hanafis often said yes. Shafi'i often said no. So it just all depends. The fundamental thing is you got to pay zakat.
Right.
So I hope that makes sense.
Regarding the primer and primer books you had mentioned, are those translated in English?
They all are translated. Most of the primers, the basic mutun, most of them are translated English. Not all, but the majority now. And most of them, it's been pretty recently that they were translated, actually. So we've been making pretty good progress in the English-speaking world with that. One Hanafi text that is like a matan that hasn't been translated yet that I really wish would be is Kanza Daqa'iq from Nasafi. But like Nurul Idah is translated. What's the Ascent to Felicity? I forget the Arabic now, something Sa'ada has been translated. And the translation of Nurul Idah is actually really quite well done. It's got even footnotes and comments from larger commentaries like Maraqi al-Falah and Hashiyat ibn Abidin and things like that. What else? Al-Hidayah in the Hanafi madhab, which is considered the biggest of the mutun or mukhtasars, is fully translated. You get bilingual editions of it. Zad al-Mustaqna' in the Hanbali madhab was recently translated by Musa Ferber, or at least I think just the Ibadat of it was. Safina al-Najah, I think he also translated the Ultimate Conspectus. I think he also translates. So Musa Ferber's been doing a lot. Those are Shafi'i texts. And then Maliki texts, a lot of them recently have been translated, like Murshid al-Mu'in, Mukhtasar Khalil, or not Mukhtasar Khalil, but Al-Akhdari has been translated.
Yeah.
Mukhtasar Khalil, that one should be translated. Hoping someone would do that soon. But yeah, generally speaking, a lot of these exist as bilingual editions even, which is really quite nice. So it's easy to get started now in the English speaking world with some basic, fiqh primers and usul fiqh primers.
I think just for the viewers as well, I think for the Hanafi, I think, they should definitely check out the White Thread Press. They translate a lot of the Hanafi texts, even the Fiqh al-Akbar. And for the Maliki fiqh, which I'm more interested in myself, Divan Press. So you can check out their website. And on Amazon, you can find amazon.com.ca, wherever you happen to live. They've been translating a lot of that, Maliki text. So those two websites definitely to check out for Hanafi and the Maliki.
Yeah, and then Musa Ferber for Shafi'i and Hanbali.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great information. And what we'll do, Brother Hamza, we'll get that list of those primer books and we'll post it on our site. And then they can refer to, and I can refer to them as well. Yeah, that's great resource that our audience can kind of bite into. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and a lot of these easy fiqh texts too. There's YouTube series of sheikhs, explaining them as well in English. So there's definitely lots of room to learn, even if you're not in a geographical location that has lots of, Muslim scholars.
So what is your view in today's time? Because it seems that a lot of the study or even awareness of the juristic schools of law it's not really emphasized, right? And if you think about it, a lot of the laws that were based on that the past Khalifa states and empires, it was based in either I guess in most cases the Hanafi law, right? And that's for society to kind of function, in a way that will kind of foster God consciousness. I just wanted to get your thoughts on why is that so right now in today's time, where it seems that it's not like it looks like Muslims don't really give much importance, I guess. Would that be a fair assessment? Or
much importance to bringing like Sharia as a system back. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, I mean that as well. That's another problem, and I think that's a problem due to the liberalization, colonization of the world. But in general, like even if Muslims want to practice, again, it's kind of in the purview, right? Oh, these, so.
Well, I feel that in the West and in America in particular, we have to remember that we were founded by religious fanatics, the Puritans who came on the Mayflower.
Mhm.
And a lot of what we call American culture is highly influenced by Puritan, Protestant ideas, Protestant ethic, Protestant worldview. And a lot of Muslims in America actually interpret their own religion through a Protestant worldview without even knowing it. And I think that affects the way that people view Islamic law and theology. And then, we have like all the secular philosophers in Western history, like Nietzsche, Kant, and Hegel, and all these different things. And I feel like positivism and kind of materialism has shaped a lot of Muslims' thought patterns. And so if they are trying to learn about Islam, they will focus on material aspects of it.
Mhm.
Oh, well, how long is your beard? Well, how long is your pants? Or do you dress Muslim? Do you wear a kufi, or do you have a shmag or something? Or they hyper fixate on some of those issues. Or what's your aqidah? Do you believe in this aqidah or that aqidah? Do you believe Allah is fis samat? Like, all those kinds of things they've become hyper fixated on them. And I believe that's from Western ways of thinking, empiricism, materialism, positivism. And it's not something, it's these debates and discussions were like not something talked about in the pre-modern period.
Mhm.
And so I feel like we need to emphasize more the inner and spiritual type things in our religion nowadays. You have in Islam always the binary between zahir and batin, the exterior and interior. And we need to focus a little more maybe on the batin nowadays, purification of the heart, manners, characters. What are the inner dimensions of Sharia, what they call asrar al-Sharia? When we're making tahara, purification, we're washing with water, making wudu, we're also purifying the inner aspects of ourselves too. And we should think about that as well. That's kind of my sideways advice or take on that. Because I feel like if we're going to decolonize minds, like it says in your background there,
Right.
that's what we should focus on.
I mean,
No, you're exactly right.
Maybe. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was going to essentially just add further to what Brother Hamza had just mentioned about the batil and the dahir, and I mean from the opposite, they may say that while the batil, right, the inner aspect of Islam, it's automatically going to come out and manifest itself if we have the outside fixed, right? So they would say, well, you know what, because we don't have a system in place at this point in time where which would facilitate the manifestation of the inner self, which would facilitate the more God conscious society, so where people can practice and they can focus on these things more, versus focusing on your inner self first and then worrying about the outside aspect. How would you counter that?
I mean, I look at the hadith of Jibreel, the second hadith that's in Imam an-Nawawi's 40.
Right.
And basically he asks, what is Islam, what is Iman, and what is Ihsan? And when I've heard ulama, give like an explanation, a sharh of this hadith, they will say those are the three pillars of deen, arkan ad-deen, three pillars of religion. We have what's commonly known as the 5 pillars of Islam, but a lot of people don't know about the 3 pillars of religion. And those are it. Islam meaning the outer practice, or the 5 pillars, the shahada and prayer, zakah, hajj, all that good stuff, right? And then Iman talks about the 6 pillars of Iman, that everyone, usually knows. And then ihsan, or striving for perfection. And that is to worship Allah as though you see Allah, even though you can't, and know verily Allah sees you.
All right.
And that perfection often is related to in order to get to that state, you have to have purification of the heart. You have to have control over your nafs, your ego, or your id, or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
You have to know, your own psychology, basically. And without a balance of all three of those, a balance between the interior and exterior, you're going to be out of whack. And I feel like there's too much focus on the exterior with some groups of Muslims. Other groups, it's all focused on the interior, and there's both of them are out of balance. We need to come more to a holistic kind of balance where we're not neglecting either side, either one. We need to know our theology, of course. We need to know our ibadat, of course, but we also need to know how to be a better human being, how to be better at actually doing the worship we profess, making sure we wake up for Fajr, and so on and so forth, right?
Agreed.
So, Brother Hamza, right now you're what's next for you? Like, I mean, you're completing that PhD, right now. What's next on?
What's in the pipeline?
Well, yep, I'm about to start a PhD program at Emory University. So I've just right now been meeting with professors and stuff on campus and getting to know everyone. And so I'll be taking probably like 2 to 3 years of classes and then doing my dissertation. They're also going to be having me teach undergraduate classes on introduction to Islam. I think they wanted me to teach a class, race and religion, which I enjoy a lot because I love reading about African-American history. And I love the intersection between Islamic ethics and Black radical ethics. I think there's a lot of cross-fertilization because the Black Power and Black radical movement evolved from Malcolm X. And so a lot of Islamic ethics is in it, and a lot of it agrees with Islam. So the Black Panthers, I'm really into the Black Panthers, and a lot of the stuff they say matches up perfectly with Islamic ethics. So I've been working on a book that's going to be a fiqh book, and it's going to be accessible to lay people, but directed at the Mufti.
Interesting.
And it's
like Ibn Rushd's book.
Kind of, yeah. And it's going to be about Black radical ethics and Sharia, and how that whenever we make fatwas here in America, we need to be aware of how it will affect Black people in America. We don't want to cause harm through our fatwa because there are, and I'm sorry to say it, and I don't mean it in any sort of bigoted way, but there are immigrant muftis who come here. They don't fully know the culture yet, and they're issuing fatwa that hurt people.
Right.
And we're only as strong as our weakest link. That's what I believe. So if you're hurting the weakest people amongst us, and I'm not saying Black people are the weakest people, but if you hurt the weakest people amongst us, that's a problem.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, the any kind of understanding or any kind of decision making when it comes to Islam it'd be better if it comes from an indigenous scholar or Muslim scholar. I mean, indigenous Muslim scholar, because they're more aware of the society and how it functions and the psychology, right? And if someone from outside comes in, they're not aware, right? So obviously, as you mentioned, I think we spoke this earlier on. I mean, it could actually hurt the cause, right? And that's part of the whole kind of making decisions in fiqh, right? Be aware of your surroundings and etc. So,
I think any fiqh ruling, I think it's probably fair to say it has to be contextualized, right? And before you relate that ruling or the fatwa. So I think that has to be emphasized more and more. So especially in the modern times, where we geographically we are dispersed all over the place, in the Western Hemisphere. and Muslim, need to be aware of that, right? So yeah, it's definitely challenging times. Absolutely.
One development in recent history, Islamic intellectual history, in terms of Sharia, is there's a new emphasis on fiqh al-waqi', it's called, or the fiqh
Yeah.
of reality. And they, even though this is kind of a new term and in a sense, it's become like compartmentalized into a new topic all of itself, kind of like Maqasid al-Sharia came out with Shatibi. It's something that's always existed in the Islamic tradition. It just never had to be emphasized like it has to be now. And that's because modernity was so disrupting to the Muslim world that we have to say, okay, we need a fiqh that acknowledges the reality right in front of us, the cultural changes and shifts right in front of us. And so that first and foremost means that you need to know what the waqi' is. You have to know like sociology and intellectual history and the cultural changes, the history of all that that's happening in front of you. One of the big theorists of fiqh al-waqi' is Abdullah bin Bayya.
Yeah.
And in his book on it, he says sometimes the waqi' or the waqa'i', plural, it's not apparent, it's not zahir. And you actually have to do some studying and some digging and some research to understand what's culturally happening around you. And I feel like a lot of muftis and ulama, they're just not doing that nowadays, or they're not consulting sociologists or cultural historians or what have you, when they could have a friend who's a professor in that field and someone they could regularly consult, or they could go and study it themselves too. You can be a mufti and a sociologist at the same time. It's possible.
Right. I think wouldn't it be fair to say that Imam Malik also emphasized quite a bit on the waqi'? Obviously, was put a lot of emphasis on on the Madinian way of doing things, right? So if you think about it, that's also kind of contextualizing. Okay, this is how we do it here in Medina, and this is how the people have been doing here in Medina, and this is the way we look at it, right? Yeah, I get it. You're bringing me this hadith, from Kufa and everything else. I'm aware of that hadith, hence the Muwatta. In the Muwatta, he goes about, talking about that hadith, but at the same time, the fiqh rulings that he produced are contrary to those very hadiths that he mentioned in Muwatta, just to emphasize on the fact, yes, I'm aware of those hadith, but at the same time, I'm not taking them and incorporating them into my fiqh rulings because the waqi', the reality of Medina, tells me differently.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like I said, it's kind of fiqh al-waqi', it's kind of been compartmentalized and emphasized more in our times now. But like some of my fiqh teachers, they said, well, this has always existed. It was just under the topic in the early usul fiqh books called masalik al-illah, or arriving to the reason behind the ruling. The way you do that is also through knowing the culture and the waqi' and all these different things, right?
Yeah.
So it's always been built into the system. It's just articulated in different ways in different times and places.
Right, because it's probably an extreme example, but if you read Ibn Battuta when he goes to Maldives, right, and where he sees Muslim women, walking around topless, right, and he errs about it, right, but at the same time he does not go and then tell them, okay, this is completely kufr, what are they doing? He just say this is just a weird Islam here. This is different, right? So he doesn't, go about, making takfir now of that society, because for them, this is not something which is sexualized, right? It's just like the African tribes, right? This is just normal, just like we have our face showing. For them, it was just normal. But that's interesting actually, and that's not very long ago. That's just like 400 or 500 years ago. So yeah, it's quite interesting. Yeah.
There's a professor, Muhammad Fadl, at University of Toronto, I believe. He's also a mufti, besides being a professor of Islamic studies there. And he issued a fatwa that was very controversial, where he said, in certain circumstances, women in America and Canada don't have to wear hijab. And he, uses arguments sort of like that. And also that, this could be fear for their life or bodily harm and different things like that. So, I mean, and some people, if I tell them about this fatwa, they just like immediately dismiss it. It's like, well, no, go read the reasoning behind it. It's reasoned perfectly from a traditional Shari'i point of view. Even though it may be controversial, I think it should be respected. And we need to stop being so quick to dismiss things that maybe isn't the cultural norm amongst Muslims, but that, we got to stop conflating culture and Sharia, because sometimes Sharia might go against what the majority of Muslims think is Islam, right?
Yeah. I think it probably also has to do with, well, before decolonization, we were relatively living under an Islamic governance, let's just call it Islamic caliphate or a dynastic rule, whatever you have. But at the same time, so the whole culture, the whole way of, living your life was very much governed by the Islamic rules and regulations. Society pretty much functioned and manifested, the Islamic spirit, right? Whereas, now, so even if you had the differences of opinion, they were not really, looked at, well, you're not really part of Islam because you have some sort of a conspiracy going on here against Islam, right? You basically got sold out or whatever, right? You're getting paid by some other government or whatnot. So that was not really part of the psyche, right? Whereas now, post-colonization, we have been obviously split into, so many different states now. The governments are, essentially puppet regimes. So maybe that's why, we have this opposite view, right? Where anything, for example, the fatwa you just mentioned right now from the Prof about, the women probably don't have to wear a hijab, if their life is at stake, is looked at, as someone who is just basically very liberal and Western minded and doesn't really have, Islam as his basis. He's just basically selling the religion, right? So I think that probably has exactly. Probably that also has, some role in it as well.
What informs me a lot about this particular topic is Professor Wa'il Halaq from Columbia. Yeah. So he's got his famous book called The Impossible State.
Amazing book.
He basically argues that, Sharia is incompatible with a modern Western nation state, which all the Muslim countries are currently involved. That's their political paradigm now. And he says that, the domain of Sharia is incompatible with what a modern nation requires. And his book, Restating Orientalism, that means Edward Said's book, Orientalism, and his new book on Taha Abdurrahman, they all kind of emphasize this idea that, maybe we need to move away from Western liberalism in the modern nation state in order to get back more to civilization where Islamic ethics, Sharia, is at the center.
Right.
And I think that, because that is really a big problem that the Ummah is dealing with. And we can't think about Sharia in terms of Western law, where it's just this code that you just follow and there's no room for difference of opinion. Because even Western law, they debate things all the time. That's why there's a Supreme Court.
Right, exactly.
But law comes from the word in English, lay. It's laid down. It's set. So I think we need to kind of decolonize from that concept.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this you brought up a really good point, and I was just kind of thinking of this in my head right now. Like you get rid of the nation state, and you have Islamic, because Islamic ethics and Sharia at the core of that society. Obviously, there'll still be a border and boundaries, right? But I know what you mean. Like you're talking about the nation state structure, right? Wouldn't exist as it exists right now. So,
yeah. But this that also means undermining capitalism. Now, a lot of Muslims, unfortunately, are attached to capitalism, and I'm not saying be socialist, but we need to have our moral Islamic economy as a main driving factor, because the main factor behind the development of the nation state was capitalism and making it as easy as possible for international trade and the flow of goods. And it was a product of colonization itself, even. And so, we kind of have to get rid of like the Protestant work ethic and these different ideas, and get rid of the ideas, that are related to political structures of the nation state, like democracy or autocracy or, whatever, and kind of of course, what we're going to have isn't going to look like the Abbasid Caliphate, Umayyad Caliphate, not even the Ottoman Empire. It'll be a new thing, but we need to make it, indigenous from the Islamic framework. And
exactly. And being that,
doesn't mean the Islamic State like Daesh, but something that fits.
All right.
Being that you, like you said, you have an interest in the movements of the Black civil rights movements and the Black Panthers. You probably know about that. I think his name is Rap Brown, who converted to Islam, right? Rap Brown, was it Rap Brown?
No, I'm not familiar.
Who's currently in jail right now because he was incarcerated. They accused him of that killing of a police officer. He's in jail right now. Do you know?
That happened to a lot of the Black Panthers.
Yeah. So, anyways, this person who had converted to Islam, and then he became an imam before he was incarcerated. He was actually trying to develop like a mini society, a Muslim society. I don't know if you remember that. And he was making success. And then he got caught, and a lot of people say that it was on trumped up charges that he killed a police officer. Now I think he's in his 70s and he's serving time in prison. But
so a lot of documents were declassified about an FBI operation called COINTELPRO. And so Hoover was blatantly racist. He was the director of the FBI, and any sort of Black power or Black nationalist movement he tried to dismantle. He killed Martin Luther King, killed Malcolm X, killed Fred Hampton of the Black Panthers, and orchestrated many of them being arrested on charges of shooting a police officer that were almost always fake and trumped up, but they could get easy convictions in racist courts. And what fascinates me about the Black Panthers, not only is their ethics similar to Islamic ethics, but many of them became Muslim. So many of the original Black Panthers are now sheikhs and imams. It's just mind-blowing. And they got this, the idea from like Marcus Garvey and Black nationalism, separatism to, that you can go out to a rural area, make your own Zawiya or Islamic, town or whatever, Islamburg, whatever you want to call it, and kind of make your own ethos in that small space. And I think it's a great thing, although I like being at the city center too, but it's possible to make a neighborhood within the city, have an Islamic ethos. In Chicago, they have Devon Street, which is kind of like that a little bit, and in Minneapolis, we have a section on Lake Street that's sort of like that. So, excuse me, it's definitely possible to kind of do that on a miniature scale. But I think that in the Muslim world in particular, there really has to be a stronger movement, like a grassroots movement, to kind of get rid of the nation state and quit pandering to the West.
All right.
No, you're right. And the point I was trying to make is what Rap Brown tried to do, the nation state structure came down on him very hard and took him out. So the point I'm trying to make, it's very hard. Like, if you attempt to do that within the nation state, you're going to come down. That's why the nation state system has to go for Islam to flourish. Basically, that's the point I was trying to make, right? So.
Yeah, that's what Al-Halaq basically says.
Yeah, I think for that to happen, from a pragmatic perspective, the vacuum has to be created, right? Maybe there is, something in the air, Russia versus Americans, right? Who knows? But I think the vacuum has to be created, and the Muslims have to be ready, and they have to be, intellectually ready at the same time, to basically take advantage of that vacuum and do something about it, right? So that's why I think the grassroots movement, where we basically emphasizing on these things, intellectually preparing the Muslims, what's about to come. I think that needs to be emphasized, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think the West has to understand that just because we want our own indigenous political system doesn't mean that it's inherently anti-West or that it's anti-business or trade too, because that just seems to be the dominant idea, misconception that's out there. Muslims might not be capitalist in the same way, but trade in money. There's nothing wrong with trade in money.
Right.
You know,
Yeah,
we
yeah,
work together, and but you go to Egypt and they might work only 6 hours a day and they relax a
yeah,
lot. And they might not have that same Protestant work ethic of constantly rushing in deadlines and blah, 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 blah. It's more relaxed work culture, but
right.
they still work, they still get their money,
Yeah, yeah.
Well, this has been a really great discussion. We've learned a lot from you, Brother Hamza. Keep up the great work. And I think we'll have you again to continue on this very, very pressing and very important topics I think us Muslims should be discussing about. So Jazakallah khair for that, Brother Hamza.
Well,
Jazakallah
yeah.
khair.
Yeah. And thank you all for listening. Assalamu alaikum.